Back on the record after a mid-afternoon break and ready for the state to call its next witness. Go ahead, Ms. Hughes.
Thank you, Your Honor. The state would call down Schincter.
Step forward, please. Raise your right hand. Do you solemnly swear the testimony you're about to give is true and correct, so help you God?
I do.
The witness chair is that one with the blue X. Go ahead, Ms. Hughes.
Sir, could you please state your first name, or I'm sorry, your first and last name?
Yes, Don Schincter, Schincter.
What is your current occupation?
I'm a special agent with the Iowa Division of Criminal Investigation.
And how long have you been employed with the Iowa Department of Investigation?
It'll be 20 years in March.
What is your current title?
I'm a special agent assigned to the Major Crime Unit.
What is the Major Crime Unit?
It's the unit within the DCI that assists local law enforcement with field cases similar to death investigations, sex assaults, thefts. It's the unit within the DCI that provides in the field assistance to local law enforcement.
Can you briefly describe your education prior to becoming a DCI agent?
I have a Bachelor's of Science and Arts degree in Sociology and Psychology from Iowa State University. Post-graduating college, I attended the 5-month State Police Academy and continuing education for the last 20 years in law enforcement.
How long have you been a DCI agent in total?
My entire length of the 20 years with DCI.
And I believe you indicated that you received initial training when you became an agent. Is that true?
I did.
And do you continue to go to trainings and different types of seminars to continue that education?
We do. We have extensive on-the-job training and then formal seminars and conferences that we're required to attend.
Now, I know a few minutes ago you indicated the types of cases you handle, and that included death investigations. Approximately how many death investigations have you been a part of as a DCI agent?
I believe I've been lead agent on over 100 death investigations. We don't keep good stats on assisting cases, but I would estimate that I've assisted on at least 100 or 150 other cases.
Can you just briefly explain your duties when you're a lead agent or an assisting agent working in those types of investigations?
Sure. So there's 26 major crime agents in the state of Iowa. We all have the same training and background, but when an assignment or a case comes in from a local jurisdiction, one DCI agent is assigned lead. That agent is technically the person responsible for gathering the information, putting a case report together, managing the other agents and local law enforcement that are assisting in the investigation.
How does DCI run in on cases?
We're an at-request agency, so we don't have original jurisdiction. We need to be invited in to work a criminal case. That happens by a local sheriff, a police chief, a county attorney, or sometimes the Attorney General's office.
I'd like to direct your attention to July 20th, 2018, where you assigned a case to assist on in Ottumwa.
I was.
How was it that you became notified of that case?
I received a call from my supervisor, at that time, Michael Motsinger.
After being called on that date, what did you do?
I responded to Ottumwa, and I met with Investigator Sieren of the Ottumwa Police Department.
What happened when you and Investigator Sieren met?
Generally, I was briefed on the investigation that they were conducting. I was informed that they were investigating the death of a 5-year-old child, and that they had some concerns about the circumstances surrounding her death.
What did you do then?
At that point, we gathered, I guess, collected some of the information that the law enforcement had done before our involvement, which was basic statements from the mother of the child, some search warrants, or I guess actually a consent search of the residence. At that time, we knew that the autopsy of the child was going to take place on the following Monday, so we kind of held off on further investigation that night.
Did you actually attend the autopsy at the state medical examiner's office on July 23rd, 2018?
I did.
During that examination, were some items, did you take possession of certain types of items that were collected that day during the autopsy?
I did.
And those items submitted to the DCI laboratory for further analysis?
Yes.
After attending the autopsy, what did you do?
I traveled back to Ottumwa, met with Investigator Sieren, who was at some of the autopsy, but not the entire length of the autopsy, and kind of made a game plan of people we wanted to interview or further investigative work that needed to be completed on the case.
The following day, on July 24th, 2018, did you conduct an interview with Kelsey Thomas?
I did.
Prior to that point, had you previously talked to Kelsey Thomas?
I had not.
Do you know if any other officers had spoken to her?
Yes.
Where did that interview on July 24th, 2018 take place?
At the Law Enforcement Center here in Ottumwa.
Who set up that interview?
I believe Investigator Sieren did the day prior, so that Monday evening. He contacted her by phone and requested that she come in for an interview.
And was that at approximately 12:30 or 1 in the afternoon that day?
I believe, yes. We asked her to come in after lunch, and I believe she showed up around 12:30.
Do you know how Kelsey Thomas arrived at the police station that day?
She came, I believe, with Aaron, which was her boyfriend at that time, in their own car.
And by Aaron, do you mean Aaron Thomas?
I do.
Once the defendant, Kelsey Thomas, arrived, what did you do?
I introduced myself to Ms. Thomas. We had never met before. I thanked her for coming in for the interview, and then I asked if she would come back into the police department to an office to be interviewed.
And did she agree to that?
She did.
Did she walk on her own into an area where you actually conducted the interview?
She did.
And what happened with regards to Aaron Thomas?
He was asked if he would also participate in the interview that was scheduled, and then he was introduced to other DCI agents and another investigator with the Ottumwa PD who interviewed him.
Where was it that you conducted this interview of the defendant?
It was in the Ottumwa Police Department's interview rooms. They have 2 rooms that are set up for interviews.
Who was present?
Myself, Investigator Sieren, and the defendant.
Prior to conducting this interview, did you Mirandize the defendant?
I did not.
Why not?
It was a voluntary, non-custodial interview. We made it clear to the defendant when she arrived that she was free to leave at any time. She was showing all the exits, how to get out of the building, and she felt comfortable coming back to that interview room and conducting the interview voluntarily.
Was the defendant handcuffed during this interview?
She was not.
You indicated that you told her that she was free to leave.
I did.
Did you show her the actual exit and to which, or how she could leave?
We did. We showed her that the doors were not locked, and the doors to actually get out of the building were fire safety doors, so she just had to press the bar to leave.
And was the door locked while you were speaking to Ms. Thomas?
No.
Now, you indicated that this was, I think you had said this was a non-custodial interview, is that correct?
That's correct.
Why was it that you conducted a non-custodial interview?
At that point, we had no criminal charges on the defendant. She was free to leave. There wasn't any reason to consider it a custodial interview.
What was the goal of this interview?
I had never spoke with the defendant before, so the goal for me was to hear in her own words what she saw and what she believed occurred the day that her child died.
What was the approach to your interview with the defendant?
It was really, we call it a cognitive style of interviewing. I simply would ask her to, so I'd start the interview by asking her to go through the day's events, kind of tell me a story about what happened in her best words, using the most recollection that she can. The goal is to let that individual talk as much as she can so I can get an understanding of what happened, since I had never been in the home and I had never talked to her before.
Now, approximately how many interviews have you done in your career as a DCI agent?
I'm sure hundreds.
Is the sole purpose of your of conducting an interview just to get a confession?
No.
Now, on July 24th, 2018, did you actually have an interview or conduct an interview with the defendant, Kelsey Thomas?
Yes.
And approximately how long did that interview last, if you recall?
I believe it started around 12:30 and concluded shortly after 5 p.m. So approximately 5 hours, 5.5 hours.
During that interview, at any time, did the defendant take any bathroom breaks?
Yes.
And do you recall how many times?
At least once, I believe twice, but I know for sure at least once.
And did the defendant ever ask for water?
I believe she was offered water. I don't know if she asked, but I know that she was given water.
And did the defendant ever step out of that room on her own?
She did.
And that was out of the same door that you indicated that was unlocked?
Yes, I would have been out of the interview room and then additionally out of actually the police department side of the law enforcement center into the common area of the law enforcement center.
at some point, did either you or investigator Sieren even tell the defendant how to get out and what she would have to do if she wanted to come back in?
Yes, we did.
At some point during that interview, did the defendant say something to you about actually leaving that day, leaving the, not just leaving the interview, but leaving the center where you guys were conducting this interview?
I'm sorry.
Did the defendant indicate something during that interview about wanting to leave?
I think at one point she did state that she wanted to leave, and I recall that we said, well, there's the door. You're welcome to leave.
And did she leave that?
She did not.
At some point, was that interview ended?
It was.
And how was it that Kelsey went home that day?
On her own, she stepped up, walked out the doors that we showed her she left, and then she left on her own.
Was there conversation about Kelsey, the defendant, coming back the following day?
There was.
And did she agree to come back the next day?
She did.
Did you force her to come back or tell her she had to?
No, we did not.
Why, or did she actually come back the next day to the station?
She did. That would have been Tuesday, I believe, the 24th.
And was an interview conducted on that date?
There was not.
And why not?
The interview was going to take place with another DCI agent, Laura Meyers. She had a scheduling conflict, so I believe the defendant showed up at the police department and then was told that unfortunately we weren't able to do the interview and asked if she would come back the next day.
And were there arrangements for her to come back then on another day, essentially?
Yes, there was.
And did you conduct another interview with the defendant on July 26, 2018?
I did.
And do you know how she got there on that date?
On that date, I believe she drove herself to the police department.
And did you have a period of time where you did, in fact, interview the defendant?
I did.
And who was present for that interview?
Myself and investigator Sieren primarily. There was a portion of time where DCI agent Laura Meyers was also present.
Now, where did you conduct that interview that day?
In the same room that we had spoken with her on that Monday.
And did you again, did you Miranda?
We did not.
And why not?
Again, it was a non-custodial interview. She was told she could leave at any time. It was in the same room that she was in prior to, so we knew that she knew how to get out of the police department.
And did you explain to her again that she was free to leave and that she didn't have to talk to you?
I did.
During that interview, were the doors locked?
No.
Now, during that second interview, I know you said that some parts were with you and investigator Sieren and some were with agent Laura Meyers. Do you recall in total that day how long the defendant was interviewed?
I believe it was a longer interview than on Monday. I believe my portion was maybe 3 hours, but she was with the other agent for several hours before, so probably 6 hours.
Were breaks taken during those interviews?
There was.
Was the defendant provided food or asked if she wanted food or water?
Yes, I think she had some trail mix with the Laura Meyers.
Did you, on that day, did you ever force the defendant to speak with you?
No.
Did you ever physically put your hands on her?
No.
Now, I know you, did you also, on this interview, conduct what you kind of described as a cognitive interview?
Yes.
And if we could just talk a little bit more briefly about that. How do you conduct a cognitive interview?
Cognitive interview is a technique in which you allow the person you're interviewing to give a free narrative or an explanation of the events in their own words, and then we would follow up as an interviewer with questions or asking for more detail about certain statements that individual said. We would confront them if there's inconsistencies with her statement. We may ask the person being interviewed to recite the chain of events in reverse order. Most people, if it's a story that they're actually recalling, can do it in front from beginning to end and end to beginning. So we're looking for those types of answers and behaviors from the person we're interviewing.
Now, in your experience conducting interviews, do you just take what a person says in an interview and just take what they say and walk out the door?
Unfortunately, we can't do that.
And why is that?
We can't take anybody's, whether it's a witness or a suspect's, word at face value. We listen to what they have to say, confront them if we think there's information that's not accurate, and then we do follow up with either other individuals that may have information or evidence in the investigation to either support or not support what that person said.
And you indicated that one of the ways that you do that is to confront them. In this specific case, did you use any information to confront the defendant?
We did.
And what kind of information, just generally, did you use?
Generally, if I recall, the bulk of the conversation we had with the defendant was the scenario in which she said how the child was found when she came into the bedroom, with what we saw as physical evidence or what the medical examiner had provided to us as information of if that act hanging in the closet by pajama pants was plausible or not.
At some point, did the defendant change her story and confess to killing her daughter?
She did.
After that portion of the interview, did she ever recant to you?
No.
Did she ever take any of what she had said then back?
No, she did not.
At some point, did you provide the defendant or ask her if she wanted a sheet of paper to write something down?
I did.
Can you just explain how that came about?
After she had confessed to killing her child, we left the room for a little bit. She was alone. I offered her a piece of paper and said, would you like to write down your thoughts? People are going to have questions of what happened here. Would you want to tell people what happened? She took that opportunity and did write a letter.
Throughout your investigation, did you just partake in executing search warrants as well?
I did.
And throughout those search warrants, were some items recovered and inventoried for this investigation?
Yeah, so we had items that were collected pursuant to my search warrants, and then additionally, items had been collected by the police department that we had a search warrant issued on to then transfer that items to the DCI lab for further analysis.
I have nothing further, Your Honor. Scott?
Thank you, Your Honor. Special Agent Schincter, you just testified about 2 interviews that took place on the 24th and 26th of July 2018, is that correct?
That's correct.
And if the transcript of the interview on July 24th reflects that it began at 12:43 and lasted until 6:29, you wouldn't have any reason to disagree with that, correct?
That's correct, and it would be audio and video recorded, so you would see when we're actually in the room and not.
Okay. And then likewise, and you estimated that particular interview was about 5 hours, but the times line up to closer to 6 hours, correct?
That's correct. If that's what it says, I wouldn't fault you if that's what the timestamp is. I would defer to the timestamp.
And likewise, for the second interview, you indicated that Ms. Thomas was subjected to interview for about 6 hours, but if the time stamps reflect that was closer to 8 hours, again, you wouldn't have any reason to dispute that, correct?
I would not.
Okay. When you first got involved in this investigation, local law enforcement had already interviewed several witnesses and did an examination of the scene, correct?
I believe they interviewed the defendant. I don't recall that they interviewed very many other people at that point.
The county medical examiner determined it was an accident, and law enforcement was leaning towards it being an accident, correct?
I'm trying to think back. I don't recall if I know what the county medical examiner ruled the scene as. I know that when we were called by the Ottumwa Police Department, they stated they initially investigated as an accident, and then the next day had some concerns about the case.
Other than denying killing her daughter until the very end of her last interview, Kelsey Thomas cooperated in every aspect of the investigation. Isn't that true?
Yes, she was asked for interviews and she showed up. She's cooperative in that aspect, yes.
As far as the search warrants that were executed for her DNA at her house for her phones, she didn't offer any resistance to any of those things, correct?
No.
And then finally, Special Agent Schincter, as far as the order of things or who asked what first or anything like that, would you agree that the transcripts that we're going to be submitting to the court would be an accurate reflection of how those conversations in the interviews of Kelsey Thomas went between you and her and Michael Sieren and her? Correct?
Yes, I would agree that the entire interview was audio and video recorded, so you should be able to hear it the best that you can with the audio equipment and then see the reactions of both of us by video.
You had mentioned that on the day of the autopsy, you traveled up and you physically observed all or a portion of the autopsy?
I believe I was there for probably 90% of the autopsy. I believe it was a lengthy autopsy, but I believe I showed up around 9 a.m. and then I left around 2. Without reviewing my notes, I wouldn't know if the autopsy concluded at 2 or not.
Okay. And at some point during the time that you were there, whether during the autopsy or right after, you did have discussions with Dr. Cavalier in which she discussed some of her findings and concerns?
She did. That's the goal of having an agent at the autopsy, is that we can hear from the medical examiner as she's doing the procedure, and talk with her and get questions answered that might aid in our investigation.
And it appeared from your questions posed to Kelsey Thomas that Dr. Cavalier provided you with some specific information, such as the upward canted litigation furrow, things of that nature that are specific to this case, correct?
I don't recall that exact terminology, but yeah, she talked about having some linear marks on her neck to us at that point, and that I guess what I took away from the meeting with Dr. Cavalier that day is that she did not believe that the story of hanging from the noose in the closet was consistent with what she was seeing at that point.
Do you recall, did Dr. Cavalier discuss with you specific injuries and why they were not consistent with the story that was presented?
With Dr. Cavalier, a lot of times she doesn't go into great detail until the autopsy is completely full, but she did go into the detail that the story that we were initially told by the defendant, or the law enforcement was initially told by the defendant, was relayed to her, and she had serious concerns about that not being the mechanism or the cause of her death. And I believe her, in her own words, she said, this warrants more investigation.
I don't have any further questions, Your
Honor. May this witness be excused?
Yes, sir.
Yes, Your Honor.
You may be excused and leave the courtroom. Off the record, yes, go ahead and see if your next witness. We're now back on the record. We're waiting for a witness, but in the meantime, the court understands that the parties have stipulated that the court receive into evidence and consider all of the evidence that was previously received in the jury trial. And it's my understanding that that evidence would all be referred to on the order concerning management of exhibits that was filed in this case March 13th, 2020. So I'm just going to read those exhibits into the record and then ask counsel if they stipulate to the court considering all of those exhibits. States Exhibit 1, 2, 3 through 51, 52, 53A, 53B, 54, 55A, 55B through 55D, 56 through 82, 84, 85, 86, 87, 88, 89, 90, 91, 92 through 95A, and 95B. Are those the exhibits that you would like for the court to receive and consider in this case, Mr. Neff? And Mr. Cook, do you so stipulate?
We so stipulate, Your Honor.
And then with respect to defendant's exhibits, A through Z, A2 through G2, H2, I2, J2, K2. Are those the exhibits you would like for the court to receive and consider in this case, Mr. Cook?
They are, Your Honor.
And do you so stipulate, Mr. Neff?
Yes, Your Honor.
The court will receive and consider all of the exhibits just referred to. There's also something called Court Exhibit 1, which was a DVD interview played to the jury off the record. I'm confused about the record. We also have Courts Exhibit 1, DVD interview played to the jury, which was originally 95B. The court has received the explanation of all of that off the record. So that exhibit will not be received by the court. All other exhibits previously referred to are now considered offered and admitted in the form they were previously filed. The court's not going to require that they be refiled for purposes of this case. It is all the same case number. I assume that these exhibits would be equally available upon a possible appeal as if the court required everything to be refiled. This is certainly a less cumbersome way of proceeding. Off the record. We could adjourn until next Tuesday. That would be a possibility if we can get done with this one last witness, and it's going to be quick. If this officer is going to be quick.
Too long. I doubt we'll be here past 4 or 4:30. So
Well, we're not going past 4:30, no matter how. Is this your officer here?
yes, ma'am.
Okay. Back on the record after mid-afternoon break.
Your Honor, at this time, the state would like to call Sergeant Michael Sieren to the stand.
Step forward, please. Raise your right hand. Do you solemnly swear the testimony you're about to give is true and correct, so help you God?
I do.
Have a seat. The witness chair is now that chair that's marked with the blue X. Go ahead, Mr. Neff.
Investigator Sieren, very briefly, could you just introduce yourself and spell your name for the record?
It's Michael Sieren, Michael Sieren.
Where are you currently employed?
I'm a police officer with the Autumnal Police Department.
What is your current rank?
I'm a first shift supervisor.
I'm sorry, did you ask?
I'm a first shift supervisor on patrol.
Prior to that position, what rank or what position did you hold at the Autumnal Police Department?
I was an investigator in the investigations division for about 4.5 years.
When did you start there?
2016.
Do you recall carrying out an investigation of the death of Cloe Chandler in 2018?
I do.
How did that investigation begin?
I was first made aware of the investigation. I had actually been in an interview in an unrelated case for a couple hours. When I emerged from that interview, I was made aware of the situation and began getting information from the responding officers.
And just for purposes of time, just generally what do you remember of those conversations and which officer comes to mind?
A good portion of the information came from Sergeant Leffler. He provided me the information that he had spoken with Ms. Chandler about, Ms. Thomas about, as far as how she, her story about how she had found her daughter, how the pants were tied, where they were located, and things of that nature.
From that point forward, what questions did you believe needed to be answered through your investigation?
So I posed several questions or concerns, if you will, initially. One of those was with the manner in which Ms. Thomas described how she had found her daughter hanging, yet when she removed her daughter from those pants, the pants just simply fell off the dowel rod. That was a point of concern for me. It seemed a little bit improbable. There was a lot of things with, at that point I really hadn't gotten information about the good idea of what the closet was like. I was able to gather more information in the following days from that. I know I immediately essentially Google searched the essentially nationwide statistics on suicides by kids as young as Chloe was. I couldn't find anything documented. That was another concern of mine, a girl this young intentionally hanging herself.
As far as the next steps you took in your investigation, what did you do next?
It was determined that an autopsy wasn't going to be performed until the start of next week, I believe on Monday. So the following day, I had made contact with Aaron Thomas to see if they'd be available to come in, essentially explain to him that there was obviously a lot of chaos when this initially occurred. We just wanted to be able to sit down with them in a little bit more controlled environment and be able to speak with them and get a full idea of what had occurred.
Interview of Kelsey Thomas, when do you recall carrying out that interview, as far as what day or date?
I initially spoke with her the following day when we did essentially a scene walkthrough with her. We did an I guess you'd say a full interview the following week. It would have been, I believe, on Tuesday after the autopsy on Monday.
As far as arriving at scenes of a death, give or take, how often have you conducted those types of scene visits in your time here in Ottumwa?
So at the Ottumwa Police Department, myself, I would imagine in excess of 50. Anytime there's a death, regardless the age of that person, natural or unnatural causes, we do what's called a death investigation. It's essentially just a documentation of the events surrounding the death. So regardless if that person's 5 years old and dies, or that person's 100 years old and dies, we still just document it.
In conducting the walkthrough that you noted took place the day after Chloe's death, was there anything that struck you as needing follow-up or warranting further investigation during that walkthrough?
I did have additional questions or things that concerned me about how this event unfolded as she described. A lot of my job is analyzing the information I'm provided to see if it is probable or is not. It seemed that if this was either an intentional act or an accidental act, as Ms. Thomas was describing, it seemed like there would have been a lot of avenues for Chloe to have gotten out of the situation she was in. So I had a lot of questions about that. I did note that Ms. Thomas, through this walkthrough, it did strike me as odd that there really wasn't any emotion involved in this. At this point, we were less than 24 hours removed from the death of her daughter, essentially, and there really wasn't any emotion involved with this, essentially walking officers and investigators through how she found her daughter dead.
As far as visiting the scene of a death, just a day later, has it occurred, or is it common in your other experience that somebody, even since then, that somebody would not show that emotion?
Generally speaking, unfortunately, I was on a situation very similar, an accidental death in this case, probably about a week ago, and generally speaking, the younger the child, the more emotions involved. I think everybody can understand if you go on a death scene and the person was 95 years old and had cancer, the family's had time to prepare for that, so there's a little bit more acceptance involved. Generally speaking, when the victim of circumstances like this, when they're very young, they're extremely emotionally volatile people that are having a really hard time dealing with a death. During the walkthrough,
Was there a time where Kelsey explained how she found Chloe in the closet?
Yes.
And what do you recall of that explanation, with a particular focus on the knot that is, or cinching that's described?
So Ms. Thomas described in, essentially we posed to her what she thought Chloe had done in order to allow this to happen. She described in her opinion, and based on the knot she had observed, based on her story, that she believed Chloe had tied a knot above the dowel rod that was hanging, and then somehow had managed to either slip, she really didn't believe that she had intentionally done it, but somehow had fell, I guess what would be in the crotch area of these pants, and then that would have been how she would have died.
As far as that knotting, what questions arose in your mind about it?
So moving back to even the first day that this had occurred, a lot of my concerns came based on my own personal experiences. At the time, I had a 5-year-old child. My concerns and things that I noted with how she described the knot, I took my, child and thought about, everybody had brought up that, Chloe knew how to tie her shoes, and wanted to relate it that, well, it was possible because, well, she knew how to tie her shoes, so she knew how to tie a knot. I think we can agree, usually when you tie that first knot, you take that shoelace and you cinch it down to the tongue. In this situation, it'd be very different because Chloe would have had to have tied a knot above her head, and she wouldn't have been able to cinch it down like that shoe tying experience. She would have had to cinch it down just enough, or else the crotch area of those pants would have came up to the dowel rod, essentially not allowing her to have had anywhere to put her head. And again, going back to how Ms. Thomas had described that this knot was apparently strong enough to hold Chloe in it, but yet it wasn't strong enough to stay there when she just simply pulled her out of it. That raised additional questions as to, you really can't have one without the other. That was some of my concerns. And then during that walkthrough, I obviously had a chance to fully look into the closet in Chloe's room. As Ms. Thomas had described, there was and I believe you've probably seen it on photos at this point, there was a tipped-over rocking chair, small children's rocking chair, that would have been to Chloe's back. In front of her, there's several 2x4s that would have been within reach. And as Ms. Thomas, and I think we all agreed, had she accidentally done this, it probably would have been somewhat of a violent situation, considering if you find yourself in a situation where you're choking, you're going to try to get out of it. So it was my opinion, based on the scene, that if she would have been moving around trying to get out of this, she would have had ways to essentially step up onto something behind her, in front of her. She had a wall to kick off to the left of her. And this is all based on Ms. Thomas's own explanation of how she found her daughter.
Were there any measurements taken as to where the rod was in relation to the floor?
Yes, there was. So the initial responding officers had taken several photos. That dowel rod from the floor, I believe, was somewhere between 61 and 62 inches off the ground. Based on the information we had and looking at the closet, that was another thing that I started running through, where I had asked Ms. Thomas to describe the space between Chloe's head to the dowel rod. So if we go back to, we're starting at 61 inches where the dowel rod is. And then she said that there was between 6 and 8 inches between Chloe's head and the dowel rod. So we're down 6 inches from there. And then Chloe herself is 46 inches, was 46 inches tall. So we have probably less than a foot difference from where her feet potentially would have been to the ground. I think I also factored in the fact that Chloe, while tying this knot, she would have had to have left enough room to fit her head in immediately, just to get her head in. And then on top of that, I can't say what the factor would have been, but those pants are going to stretch. I'm guessing at this point you've seen the pants that were described as being involved. It was very apparent to me that these pants were considerably stretched out. So in my opinion, based on all the measurements that were taken, we're almost to a point where Chloe would have been nearly touching the ground. And even if she wasn't, as I described, there was a rocking chair behind her, there was the 2x4s in front of her, and a wall to her left that really seemed like she would have had a lot of avenues. I had also asked Ms. Thomas, if there was anything that was holding her head down to keep her in those pajamas. I had expressed a point to her that, if someone is, say, choked out, they're going to go unconscious, and they're going to lose control of their functions, their muscles. I just found it hard to believe that her head would have just laid there, and her muscles would have somehow just kept her head in those pants, and not just her head flipped back, allowing her to fall out of that. There was just a lot of things that just didn't seem like it would have worked out the way she was describing.
As far as the floor itself, do you remember anything sticking out to you as far as, I guess, the state of debris and whatnot on the ground?
So I did not respond that first day. I know from the photos, and even that day when I went, I can't say if things had been moved around a little bit. I know Ms. Thomas said they had done a little bit of a cleaning. I'm not sure if it was in her room or not. But there was a lot of items in that closet floor that I think included clothes, blankets. Essentially, it was just, I would say, pretty well covered.
At least under the area that Chloe was described by Ms. Thomas as having hung, was there any indication that the stool had been within that debris there?
So it was my understanding based on, and I believe I specifically asked Ms. Thomas this, I believe she described that the way we found that rocking chair was in the same manner it had been in there for several months. I believe she described that the chair had been broken, but Chloe liked to be in the closet, and although it was broken, they still kept it for her. So I believe it was, as she recalled, in the same position it was when we arrived.
What was the next step in your investigation from that walkthrough?
After we did the walkthrough, the autopsy was scheduled for Monday. Myself and Investigator Adams attended that. DCI agent Schincter also attended that, and the county attorney at the time also as well.
What do you recall from that meeting, if anything?
Ms. Cavalier had pointed out some things of concern. I don't recall her really making any judgments at that point. I believe she said that she still needed more information. I personally didn't really have a whole lot of conversation with her. I left prior to the conclusion. She still had a lot of work to do, and we were going to return to Ottumwa to continue our investigation.
At least from what she did describe to you while you were present, do you recall anything, or what was your understanding of what she was telling you?
If I recall, I think she questioned the pants being the mechanism that had caused these injuries in the way that she described it. That's really all that I recall. As I said, I really didn't speak in depth with her. I think she was generally pretty brief and vague because she needed more information before she could really make any findings, I guess.
And after that meeting, after you left, what was the next step you took in your investigation?
We had set up an interview with Ms. Thomas. We spoke with her the following day, which would have been Tuesday.
And at least at that point, did you have any specific conclusions from Dr. Cavalier?
Not to my knowledge, no.
When was the next time you spoke to Kelsey Thomas?
We spoke with her on Thursday.
Would it sound correct that was July 26th, 2018?
Yes, I believe so.
Up to that point, what did you have in mind when going in to question Kelsey?
As previously stated, we had a lot of concerns based on story that Ms. Thomas provided, the way that she found her, the information she provided of how she was tied up, we really just felt strongly that what she was describing just was not plausible, and there was a lot of information that had been looked into at that point that just led us to really strongly believe that we needed to to really get to the bottom of the truth, essentially, which we believed was not what she was describing to us.
As far as any jail-recorded phone calls placed by Kelsey Thomas, you're the investigator that found those, correct?
I believe I had requested the intake phone calls from one of the jail administrators, and there was 2 of them that he would have provided me.
Were these calls placed once you had ended your questioning of Ms. Thomas?
Correct. I believe the first call would have been somewhere around 30 minutes after, and then the second call maybe 50 minutes to an hour after we had ceased contact with her.
And I presume the timestamps on those calls would be the best reference to the time they were made at, correct?
Correct.
You were not present with Ms. Thomas as she made those calls?
No.
At least as to your understanding of the jail, given that you've been an investigator in the same building and handled jail phone calls and retrieved them for investigations, is there a deputy sitting right next to folks as they make those phone calls?
No. Generally speaking, when someone in Ms. Thomas's situation where she was just booked into jail, she would have went in, been asked a series of questions by the jailer. Likely, most people request a phone call. The jailer will dial the number for them, hand them the phone, and then continue typing whatever intake paperwork they need to do. So there would be a jailer sitting kind of catty corner to them. They're not exactly monitoring their phone calls.
As far as phone calls placed later after the intake process, do you know where those phones are located in the jail?
I don't believe I've been back to general population. I believe essentially they're able to make phone calls freely if they're out of their cell, but I'm not exactly sure the access that they have to the phones where they're at in the jail.
A moment, Your Honor. I'd pass the witness.
Thank you, Your Honor. Investigator, I'm sorry, Sergeant Sieren, you had talked earlier about how you were only 1 day removed from the incident, and you noted a lack of emotion in Kelsey Thomas, correct?
Correct.
You noted that same lack of emotion in Aaron Thomas, her husband, too, correct?
Yes.
And ultimately, you don't believe Aaron Thomas was involved in the death of Cloe Chandler, correct?
Correct.
Aaron Thomas and Kelsey Thomas, from an emotional standpoint, essentially presented in a same or similar way to you, correct?
I would say Aaron, when he spoke a little bit more abnormally. It's hard for me to describe it. It seemed like he had a little bit of a gut-wrenching feeling, but generally speaking, I didn't see any crying or anything like that from him.
When Kelsey was describing ravioli coming out of Chloe's mouth during the walkthrough, Aaron laughed, correct?
Correct.
You were asked about your initial thoughts going into this, and your impression would have been that the hanging in the closet would have been some sort of violent struggle, correct?
The basis of my opinion was if it had been an accidental situation that she found herself in, she would have struggled to get out of it, yes.
And if other officers who responded the day of the incident located debris in the bottom of that closet, that would support Kelsey Thomas's story, wouldn't it? Would debris in the bottom of the closet where she said Chloe was found, if there's debris on the bottom of the closet floor, that would support her statement, correct?
What debris are you speaking of?
I'm asking you, if there were debris found at the bottom of the closet, that would support Kelsey Thomas's story, would it not?
What do you mean by debris?
For instance, drywall debris.
Correct. I believe the officers did not note any damage to the inside of that that was consistent to be with, I don't think there were any holes in the closet or things like that. I myself didn't observe any drywall dust or things like that.
And you, having the experience that you have, certainly have been to crime scenes before, and when law enforcement documents a crime scene, if there's something of interest, it's important for them to document the overall picture where that item was found, and then taking a series of photographs, hone in on that item of interest, correct?
Correct.
And that's police documentation 101, essentially, correct?
Correct.
Now, the opinions that you've expressed about the plausibility and things like that of Kelsey Thomas's situation, you don't have any medical training, correct?
No.
Do you know the difference between a full suspension hanging and a partial suspension hanging, and the implications of one or the other?
As far as medically, no.
Okay. In this particular case, you seized Kelsey Thomas and Aaron Thomas's cell phones. You looked at Facebook, Snapchat, phone records, text messages, phone logs, all subject to the search warrants that you applied for, correct?
Correct.
Typically, those are treasure troves for criminal information if during an investigation, correct?
If more than one person's involved.
And in this case, you didn't find any incriminating evidence on any, as a result of the search warrant executed on any of those items, correct?
Correct.
And in fact, may I approach, Your Honor? You obtained phone text message logs. If I may approach, this is J2, it's the same as before. This portion of the phone log, and you've seen that before, Sergeant Sieren, that is a portion of the phone log that you were able to obtain based on your search warrant of Kelsey Thomas's phone, correct?
This is a Celebrite extraction that depicts a part of the phone log, correct?
Okay, and that phone log particularly demonstrates, based on the numbers associated in the first column, that those are in sequential order. There's nothing missing from that, correct?
Correct.
And essentially, that phone log lines up directly, I'll go ahead and take that back from you. That phone log lines up directly with what Kelsey Thomas told you from the time she woke up. She missed a phone call, she texted her grandma back, she called Aaron. There was a brief period of time, and then she called Aaron back and called 911. All of that and what Kelsey said comports with this document, correct?
Correct, as it pertains to the phone calls, yep.
Counsel, what document are you referring to?
This would be Defendant's Exhibit J2.
Thank you.
And likewise, that search warrant would have allowed you to see internet searches. So oftentimes, somebody might do an internet search of how do I get rid of DNA or something else that obviously has to do with the incident and is incriminating, correct? In your experience, correct?
Correct. I don't know if this Celebrite dump or extraction pulled that information. I'd have to look at it. We're essentially at the mercy of the Celebrite extraction. It just depends on the phone, the model, things like that. Sometimes it gets certain information, sometimes it doesn't.
If you were able to get any sort of incriminating evidence from the Celebrite download or anything that was subject to that search warrant, certainly you'd be here talking about it, correct?
Absolutely.
And I believe during your interview with Ms. Thomas, you in fact made it as a point of emphasis to tell her, look, we've got this fancy Celebrite machine. It's going to take everything, including stuff that you've deleted from your phone. Do you recall telling her that?
If that's what the record reflects, then yes, I obviously have talked to a lot of people since then.
Okay. And again, whether or not your machine could have extracted the deleted information, the fact is you didn't find any information that Kelsey Thomas deleted from her phone at all, correct?
I'd have to look at the Celebrite. Nothing of note.
If there was something of note, you'd be here testifying about it, correct?
Correct. All I'm saying is if it says it's been deleted, I don't know what it is. So I can't test
I'm
it.
aware of that happening at all in this case, correct?
I'm not sure if that happened at all.
And again, if you were sure that would happen, you'd be telling the court about it, correct? If you were confident that Kelsey Thomas deleted something off her phone, you would have certainly testified about it, correct?
I can't testify to what I don't know about.
I'll move on. Now, in your direct, you talked about the pajama pants and your concerns about those not being the mechanism that caused Chloe's death, correct? In your direct examination, you were just having that conversation, correct?
Correct.
And in your interviews with Kelsey Thomas, you mentioned numerous times that the pants did not cause the injuries. The doctors tell us the pants did not cause the injuries, correct?
Correct.
And as far as who asked what first or what have you, you would agree that the audio, video, and transcript recordings of your interviews with Kelsey Thomas would be the best evidence of what actually transpired, correct?
Correct.
I have no further questions, Your Honor.
Redirect?
No, Your Honor, we do excuse this witness.
You may be excused and leave the courtroom. Off the record. So, Mr. Neff, Ms. Hughes, that's all the witnesses that the state has to offer in person. But you have a stipulation that I think I understand is going to be reduced to writing between you and Mr. Cook.
Yes, sir.
We already have it.
Oh, okay.
And we're off the record, just talking. So you've got the stipulation that you're going to reduce to writing, and you've got some transcripts that you're going to mark, and I assume they're going to be marked with, numbers? You guys had numbers? So.
Yes, and I believe the ones in EUMS are, but I will still provide physical copies.
You
or at
think?
least when I pull it up, it seems they are. I don't know if it's different.
They are marked, but unfortunately, they've already been numbered.
I think Judge, we'll make sure that we mark them appropriately in file.
Okay, yeah. We mark them appropriately, whatever the number should be, because I certainly want to make a record about what the correct number is, that I'm receiving them under the correct number. And I would really like physical copies of all the transcripts that you're adding in. I don't need, photographs or anything that's previously in the record. I don't need that. But if you're adding in, that I would like physical copies of, so I can highlight and all that.
That'd be fine, Your Honor. Also,
yeah.
I'm sorry to interrupt. Would it help the court if we created, I know we've already stipulated to the original, essentially a documentation of exhibits that were admitted, but create essentially a new list of exhibits that incorporates the last trial's list of exhibits as well as these new exhibits, and just provide that also.
Sure. I mean, Carrie, she's given some brief summaries of what they are, but you maybe have a better summary of each of those, what it is, and that would be helpful. Yes, that would definitely be helpful. And then these 3 other things, if they're whatever they are, let me see.
We will have them in their own CD, essentially, so that there will be a physical
Okay, yeah, that would be good.
exhibit to admit.
Yes, that would all be good. But you maybe want some time to do that, and you'd rather provide those next Tuesday. Is that kind of what I'm hearing?
That would be excellent. Thank
Okay.
you.
Okay.
I have a question for you both about the interviews, because I believe 95A and 95B have been redacted previously for the jury, but the transcripts are going to have all of that. Are you planning on resubmitting just the complete version?
I think so, so I think we're gonna have to add that to the written stipulation and then put it on the record next
Okay.
time. We can talk about it.
Okay, so the state's not going to rest now because you've got all that to offer, and that's fine. But again, if I'm understanding this right, we won't have any other evidence produced until what's next Tuesday? The 20th?
Correct.
The 20th. And at that time, we're going to hear from a doctor. Excuse me?
Dr. Young, Judge?
Dr. Young. And is Dr. Young coming in person or by Zoom?
He's prepared.
We prepared, we wanted to see how Dr. Chandler worked, and I think we made up our mind that you will be appearing live.
He will be appearing live. Okay. And, you don't have to tell me now, but there could be some further evidence. We could not be done on Tuesday. We could be going into Wednesday with your evidence, or if you don't.
I would think even with the unknown factor, Judge, we would still be able to close evidence Tuesday.
Okay. But there might be rebuttal evidence, possibly.
Just like last time, it's always possible. But
Well, right.
we'll
So,
see.
yeah,
So
and that's,
please.
yeah, I understand that it's not appropriate to try to pin you down now. Okay, so I think we have an understanding how we're going to proceed. Are there any, and I'll be around, you can certainly, email me if things arise, but are there any other concerns or issues that you want to bring up, either, again, just talking informally, that you want to bring up with me now?
None come to mind, Your Honor.
Nothing at this time, Your Honor.
Okay. Then we'll just go back on the record, so briefly summarize what's going to happen. Back on the record. The state has not rested, but the court's informed that the state has finished with all witnesses, and the state is going to be offering certain exhibits, and I believe it's going to be stipulated that the court receive those exhibits. Those exhibits are not available here this afternoon, but they will be available when we resume, which will be next Tuesday, October 20th at 9. After the court has received those stipulated exhibits and perhaps a written stipulation between counsel, then it's the court's understanding that the state will rest. After the state rests, defendants have at least one exhibit, one live witness, Dr. Young. And from there on out, it's not quite so clear how it will proceed, but I think we all have an understanding as to adjourning at this point, resuming Tuesday, October 20th at 9 a.m. So, Mr. Neff, is that?
That is correct, Your Honor.
That's all agreeable, Your Honor.
Okay. Very good. And that completes the record at this time. Oh, I suppose I should. Well, they grab my notes and then I'm going to try to record everything.